Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the weekend edition of Woman's Hour. In the show today, we're discussing the age-old conversation, women and work and children. Yes, you're right. It's terrible that we need to have that conversation in 2018, but we do, and we had it again this week on the programme. Now, as schools went back in parts of the country this week, inevitably the conversation turned to childcare and how you combine looking after small children and carrying on with the world of work. There was a report from the TUC on childcare fees in England. That report said they have risen 3 times faster than wages since 2008. And then the childcare industry reported that they were struggling as well. Since the government introduced 30 hours of free childcare, many said this week that businesses have been really struggling financially. So wherever you look, there are issues. Sian Griffiths is the education and parenting editor at the Sunday Times. Christine Armstrong is a mother of 3 young children and the author of a new book called The Mother of All Jobs. So the question we shouldn't have to ask, but we are still asking, how do you combine motherhood particularly and working and childcare? Here's Christine.
Part of my experience was trying to combine a full-time job with small children. And it was very, very difficult. I think we're looking at an hours culture that's expanding. The working day has expanded in the last 20 years from sort of 7 core hours and, more one-parent working families where now we've probably got 2 parents, if there are 2 parents in a household working. I think the cost of childcare issue is a huge problem, but also I think the length of childcare provided, if you can get it and you can afford to have it, is also a very big mismatch with the working day, which a lot of people are frustrated by. I spoke to a mother last week who was working in accountancy who said, one of my biggest problems is that the after-school clubs at primary finish at 6 o'clock. And you think, well, that's completely insane. But in her working world, nobody leaves before 6 o'clock.
Well, you start the book by pointing out that, in fact, for our parents' generation, your parents' generation, it was absolutely a different working world. There were no nighttime emails or phone calls. There wasn't much working from home or at home, was there?
There wasn't. And I actually convened a group of my mother's friends who I call sort of the grandmother's focus group and said, what's the difference between when you were trying to do it and when we were? And they were sort of very positive initially. They were like, well, you've got flexible work and you can work from home and dads do so much more and things are really good. And I said, well, so is that working out well? What do you see with your daughters and daughters-in-law and their experience? And then they sort of went, well, actually they seem really stressed and they feel very insecure about some of their jobs. They feel that if they don't answer all these messages that their job might be under threat, and they, it's really difficult. And actually, with both parents working and not having parents at home so often, there's very little time in the day sometimes for the children to fit in, which is sad.
Now, Sian, you're a journalist. You've been employed all your working life as a journalist, not freelance. You've had a job.
That's correct. I've been a full-time staff journalist since 23, and I left university. And it was very tough. 20 years ago, when my children were small, there were no morning breakfast clubs. There was no after-school provision, and so even the idea that you could put your children into full-time childcare was not acceptable. And it was a real struggle. It cost more than my salary to put them into a nursery, a workplace nursery, which I managed to find in London. But actually, I would say it was so worth it because...
Well, that was going to be my question. When you state that fact very baldly, it actually made no financial sense, but it made another sort of sense, or you were thinking long-term about your career prospects?
I wasn't actually consciously thinking long term about my career prospects. I was just very aware that if I stepped out of my job at that point, in 2 or 3 years, we wouldn't be able to afford the mortgage. I wouldn't have a career. I wouldn't have a job. I didn't know how I would get back to journalism because it is so competitive. I didn't know what else I could do to earn that kind of money. There were 3 or 4 years until they went to school where we absolutely had to scramble. And my family were tremendous. My parents were tremendous helping out in the holidays. But we got through it. And I think that's my message really is... Don't think that you have to be perfect. Don't think that you have to answer every email. Leave work when you have to leave work to pick up your kids. You will not get sacked. You will muddle through.
Well, yeah, that's what Christine said as well, except I'm not certain that is always true. You're confident, are you, Christine, that you really can walk out of a meeting or never attend it in the first place?
No, I'm not confident of that at all. I think lots of workplaces would discriminate very actively against that. You talk to people who've come back from maternity leave. A woman said she got an appraisal when she came back from maternity leave and she'd been scored very low, which puts her job at risk. And when she asked her male manager why, he said, well, you didn't complete the project. And she said, well, of course I didn't complete the project. I was on maternity leave. He said, well, I can't score you if you don't. So her job is under threat
Let me
because
just
she's taking maternity leave.
A good point from a listener called Claire, and thank you for this, Claire. Are Women's Hour really still asking the question, is it possible to combine motherhood with a career? And I get why Claire's indignant that we're asking that very question, except I actually think, as your book illustrates, it is still a question we need to ask.
Well, that's what I thought listening to Sian was how little has changed in some ways. Is I still interview lots of women who spend more on childcare than they earn and are very frustrated by that. I think the things that have changed are the hours culture and the always on business, which I think makes it worse. I think you can do it, but I think you have to be very disciplined and very thoughtful and fortunate. And I think one of the things that concerns me is a narrative where we hear from very senior women who, because they're attached to an employer, very reasonably say, this is possible. They want to support other women. You have to work really, really hard and be well organised. And lots of people are out there that I interview say, actually, I feel like I'm failing all of the time and I think it's me. And what I want to say with this book was, well, it's not you. The system wasn't designed this way. You may be able to make it work for you, but you're going to have to try quite hard to do that. It's not just going to work for you.
Sian, your children are in their 20s. One indeed is married. Did they ever question your working life choices?
They didn't actively question my working life choices, but I'd say my daughter now, I'm not sure that she's going to want the same sort of full-on experience that I had. I think she will.
That's interesting. What do you mean?
I think she's going to be keener when she has a family to spend probably more time with the children than I did, to be honest. And I think she may go part-time in a way that I didn't consider doing.
Again, we often talk on the programme about the sorts of muddling through, already been alluded to, that many of us have done when our children were younger. If your family are living relatively close, then that can be a good option.
It's a huge benefit, enormous, absolutely brilliant. And it is transformative. If people have moved to another area, if they've moved internationally, it really is a game changer in terms of not having that support. And also, if you work so hard that you don't have local social networks, so you don't know other parents, other families living locally, that is hugely problematic because you've got no one to call when the train's stuck, when you're delayed, no one to help you. And so one of the big things I say quite often is, put a bit of effort, if you can, into making sure you know people locally, especially if you move or you're starting at a new school, because that can really help with the experience.
This is from Bernie, who says, our absurd working culture ensures parents are always stressed and feeling in the wrong. It all adds to that ridiculously expensive childcare arrangement situation, and it's no surprise we're still discussing this. The government see families as sources of income, not society. He's making a sort of sociological point there. What do you think about that, Sian?
Oh, I do think there's a real postcode lottery actually with nurseries and childcare, and I think if you're lucky enough to live in a place which has got really good nursery provision and is providing, the 30 hours free childcare, I think you're lucky, because there are parts of the country where that is very difficult, and the nearest nursery is a long way away. I do think there is that difficult gap. So you're entitled to 1 year of maternity leave till your child is one, and the employer has to hold the job open. And then there is provision for 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, that the government subsidises. But there is a gap for the child aged between 1 and 2. And I do think the government should and could step into that gap and provide more subsidised childcare there.
Sian Griffiths and Christine Armstrong. Lots of people wanted to comment after that conversation, and indeed during it, with many of you taking issue with the whole idea that we shouldn't have to have this conversation. But I've tried to explain that we try and discuss the world not as it should be, but as it is. This from Wendy. 23 years ago, I became a mum at the age of 44 and with no chance of a second child. I had a career, a mortgage, and the knowledge that I would be retiring before the end of my son's education. The nursery was very accommodating, and our son joined it from the age of 10 months. During school years, until he was 11, I took my entitlement of an additional 1 month's unpaid leave every year. I used childcare and my circle of other working mum friends to cover. However, that sense of guilt of being the absent mum did stay with me. A chance conversation with my now 23-year-old physics undergraduate son brought about this completely unsolicited comment. Oh, I'd always put my children through nursery education. It was the best thing. I can walk into any situation and feel comfortable talking to anybody. You have to do that at nursery level and get on with people. I've been able to do that all my life. Well, Wendy says, after that, I no longer feel any sense of guilt. I hope this helps any mums who might have those familiar feelings about somebody else caring for their young children. Wendy, thank you for that. A positive spin on the whole thing from Wendy. And of course, you can contact the programme whenever you like on any subject through the website bbc.co.uk/Woman's Hour.